So can you explain a bit about why this polling that you've been doing is new? You know, it does something that we haven't seen in polling before on this topic.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a lot of polling on the economy that kind of starts and ends with what do people think about these kind of short-term policy measures? And that's good. That's important. Like, we have a lot of that in the research. But I think the thing that's most interesting about this is it trying to gets underneath things a little bit more and looks at not just the kind of short-term risks and rewards around decision making, but what are the kind of counterfactuals? What are the kind of things that voters will kind of truly punish and reward the government for over the long term? So it's trying to get at, not just testing should they do this or that policy, but what happens if they don't do this or that policy or fail on this or that policy area. It's just a slightly longer term view and trying to basically force the kind of trade-offs on voters that the government actually faces. That's
really interesting, because usually in sort of basic polling on these kind of issues, the trade-offs don't come under it, do they? So you have a question, do you want to tax the wealthy more? You know, people will just tick yes. Yep. Or do you want your taxes to go up? People will tick no. Right. But if you start asking them questions after that, such as, if your taxes went up, but it meant that, child poverty started to be eradicated or the cost of living was more manageable, then you start to see slightly different results. So that's that trade-off idea. Sorry, that's a very basic explanation of what you're doing in your polling, but that's what makes it different from the usual headline kind of public attitudes that we see on potential tax solutions for the government. Yes, exactly. Yeah. There's of course no perfect way of studying this, but I think this is a kind of what we've done here is a little bit different and a bit more in depth for that reason. Yeah. And so you've looked at this in depth. What do you actually find? What stood out to you? So maybe I'll explain a little bit first about kind of how we went about this particular bit in the experiment. Yeah. So what we did was basically invited like 4,000 people into a survey, and instead of just asking questions on do you support this or that policy, what we did is showed them the government's record at the end of this parliament. Okay, so we said, look, imagine this is the record that the Labour government stands for re-election on, and they had 3 good kind of policy successes, let's say, and then we had 3 policy failures, and we randomized those successes and failures, so taking it from a long list, and then we asked, okay, well, how much would you approve of a government that stood on this record, which is a question we know is like very correlated with the re-election chances of an incumbent government. Right. And crucially, like in the analysis, what we're looking at is how much the different outcomes, policy outcomes, let's say, or different trade-offs push up on government approval and how much do they push down on government approval. And then in the mix there, what we did is we threw in basically failure on and success on different public services and kind of cost of living items, as well as like failure on keeping to manifesto promises around tax. So that's more or less what we did, and then we can break the results down and see what are those policies that really push up and down on government approval. It's not perfect, but it's that way at kind of getting at revealing some of the voters' priorities, I suppose. Yeah. So basically, what do they prioritise more by the end of this parliament? Would they like the NHS to be functioning better, even if that meant that it was at the expense of the government breaking its tax promises, for example? Exactly. Yeah. And so what did you find? Yeah, so I guess I'll talk to the main themes, and then people can have a look at the full research and the numbers. But I think it's pretty striking, okay? So, I mean, what we find in top-line terms is obviously in terms of the things the government gets rewarded for, like the NHS and tangible progress around the NHS is still like very salient, as well as small boats, progress on small boats. For example, things like climate and the energy independence are still disproportionately salient to the Labour coalition. But I guess what's really interesting is like if you look at the kind of punishment side of the ledger, right? Because that's probably the world we're in, is sort of looking at that and what the kind of the least worst options are there. Yeah. So there was so what we found is quite clear. So there was a penalty among voters in this experiment for the government breaching its manifesto pledges on, let's say, income tax or national insurance, right? So it knocked about 3 or 4 points off the government's average approval in the experiment. But and this is to your point about trade-offs, that is much lower than the penalty they received for failing on public services, crime, NHS. Interestingly, manifest failure on child poverty was very harshly punished in the experiment, which surprised me. Maybe we can come back to why that is later. But I think these dynamics were particularly intense with the Labour coalition. So the punishment that Labour voters meted out for tangibly failing on the NHS, crime, cost of living, inequality, these were much harsher than
the penalties they meted out for kind of basically breaking the manifesto on tax. So that was quite interesting and striking to me, and maybe we can get into kind of why that is. But yeah, it was quite a clear finding in the research that it's not a free lunch to break the manifesto. It's just significantly worse to fail on those areas.
Yeah, and so that kind of presents this fundamental policy dilemma for the government, really, doesn't it? If it's only possible to avoid failure on those areas that you say that are very important to voters by breaking those tax promises, the least worst option for the government is breaching its manifesto, which is something that, the government doesn't want to do. It's politically distasteful to break those kind of promises. So that's the position that your polling finds that they find themselves in, and they're probably aware of this too.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth being clear, we are very much in the land of least worst options here, and if that is the choice, okay? So if it is the choice that you can't avoid failure on those areas without basically significant amounts more investment, then I think that is the choice they face. It's worth being clear, it's not a free lunch. I mean, it's very clear in the research. People are highly distrustful right now. They are feeling very squeezed. They do not want to pay lots more tax. Their first preference is very clearly that the rich or somebody else pays more, or that the fiscal rules change or something like that. But if the choice truly is essentially fail on those areas or breach the manifesto, then it's very clear that people will be annoyed by raising taxes, but it seems to me fairly clear that they'll be even more kind of annoyed if in 4 years' time they can't get a doctor's appointment, or their energy bills are still high, or they're reading lots of stories about more kids falling into poverty. And I think it's worth reflecting on kind of why that is, particularly that child poverty piece. It's not that people walk around with, let's say, child poverty as their number one issue, but I think it is about expectations, right? It's about what people kind of at some level expect from Labour governments. Yeah. Even though they don't want to pay more tax and they would prefer not to, I think at some level most voters sort of feel or suspect that that's kind of what Labour governments do, that they put taxes up, unfortunately for them. But what they don't expect is Labour governments to kind of manifestly fail on public services or inequality or poverty. Those are issues that are much more tied to the Labour brand. So I think that probably explains a bit about this kind of balance of punishment and reward that we see, and why, my conclusion in the research is, there are no good options here, but the least worst option is probably breaking the manifesto if that is the choice.
And I suppose the other side of that coin, those things go with the Labour brand. I suppose what also goes with the Labour brand on the negative side is that they are seen as the party more profligate with public finances, the party that will impose higher taxes. And perhaps they get away with breaking their manifesto promises in terms of going with the grain of their brand in that sense as well. I know that's sort of more negative than the other side of the brand that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and of course Labour strategists have tried to do quite a lot of work to try and kind of neutralise that brand, but it's still kind of there, right? And again, I'm not saying that therefore, fine, lean into it, everything's great. Clearly there is some penalty. It's just that, my personal view is that the shape of the Labour's mandate last year ran through basically the crumbling public realm, and that in the end is more salient to people and why they voted Labour than anything else, even though there were important ways that the Labour brand had changed a bit. I think, people's priorities were reasonably clear. For me, it's a bit analogous to, let's say Labour failing on public services or child inequality, I think is probably a bit analogous to the Conservatives failing on migration, right? It's just like a very core part of what people expect governments to do, or in that case a Conservative government. Likewise, the mini budget around Liz Truss, it just offended people's sense of expectations of what Conservative governments are for, and I think there's a risk here that Labour falls into the same thing but on their issues.
Yeah, and at the moment, let's look at the political realities. At the moment, we're seeing all of these little reports that come out ahead of the budget, as we always do ahead of budgets, testing really various measures that the Chancellor could use to raise revenues, and none of them concern breaking the manifesto promises, although there have been some rumours of raising income tax lately. But they generally seem to centre around smaller tweaks to the tax system. We saw that actually in the first budget, with the inheritance tax on farmers, for example. Now we're hearing about a potential gambling levy, limits to tax-free allowances that you put in your ISA, a windfall tax on banks. So various smaller scale, I think, tax rises than what you're talking about in terms of breaching those manifesto promises on income tax, VAT and national insurance. But does that not risk, looking at your polling, annoying people with tax rises, but not actually raising enough money to fix the most prioritised issues in voters' minds?
Yeah, I think the grim reality for the government is they might need to do a bit of everything, as I understand it from looking at the analysis, that they might need to do some of these kind of smaller, narrow tax rises as well as sort of broader-based ones. It is true that those narrow ones are kind of, on paper anyway, more popular. But of course, as you say, they risk upsetting like noisy stakeholder groups. So there is kind of no free lunch here. I think, this is just me speaking here. I'm not a policy expert, and it's easy to say this from the outside. But having spent quite a long time looking at attitudes on this, I think probably the worst place for the government to be in, frankly, is like raising enough tax to annoy people, but not enough to kind of actually drive improvement in any kind of way. And I think there is a bit of a risk that they fall into that danger zone because that's the path of least resistance to a degree. So again, it is my personal view, but my view is if they're going to do this, if they're going to have to break the manifesto, you might as well kind of do it properly, right? You do it basically enough. You raise enough to build up some headroom. You raise enough to give something back to people in terms of short-term cost of living measures, for example, on energy bills. You raise enough to kind of put into the things that they care about long-term around public services that they'll hold this government accountable to most. So yeah, I think my view is I'm very much kind of team rip the Band-Aid off, personally speaking. But of course, easy for me to say from the outside. I do think, that the bigger risk is just that basically they raise tax to fill in an OBR hole, maybe, and that the voters don't kind of see anything tangibly in the long term. So yeah, I think it's a grim set of choices, but that's how I would think about it.
And whenever we do podcasts about raising tax, and we had a very popular cover earlier this year, Just Raise Tax, by our economics writer Will Dunn, which really caught the public imagination. Our readers always ask about wealth taxes. Why can't Labour tax wealth instead of work, or at least raise taxes on wealth rather than raising tax on work? And would that not introduce enough money into the Treasury to make those kind of tangible changes that we've just been talking about? Is that how did that feature in your research?
Yeah, I mean, so it's worth being clear. People's first preference is for that kind of stuff, right? There is a kind of anyone but me sense on tax, which is, I would prefer the rich and the wealthiest to pay more. And actually, when people in Westminster can be dismissive of that kind of polling, but actually it's pretty robust. I mean, even when you test it against ideas that the wealthy will flee, it holds up. Even when you stress test it against different case studies, generally support for taxes on the rich and the wealthiest is pretty robust. And likewise, people are also okay with changing fiscal rules if that's the choice. The issue is, I think, just kind of, as I understand it, the policy reality, right? So some of these wealth taxes do raise some cash, but a lot of them, there's probably not going to be enough to dig the government out of its hole and also drive improvements in lots of different areas that voters care about. So I don't think there's really good public attitude reasons not to do those wealth taxes. I do think there are kind of practical ones.
Right.
And likewise with fiscal rules, there's lots of good policy reasons not to come back and keep tinkering with fiscal rules. So yeah, public attitudes on that stuff, I think, are pretty robust. But yeah, it's just a practical question of like what actually raises money, I think.
It comes back to your, the basis of your research, which is, at the end of this parliament, what does it look like the government's actually done with the money that it's raised?
Exactly.
Yeah. And we've been talking about the risks and potential, rewards of breaking these manifesto pledges. But actually, you could argue one of those pledges has already been broken, raising national insurance. That national insurance on businesses was raised, not on workers specifically. Does your polling show that Labour did get away with this? We're not talking from the policy side of things. We're talking from public attitudes, because obviously businesses have been talking a lot about how much it's hurt them.
Yeah, I think so, right? And that goes to my point about these kind of narrow taxes on like groups or business. I mean, they're very, very unpopular with stakeholder groups. They create noise and friction in the media, and that's not irrelevant. But I think, sure, it comes up a bit in focus groups that people sense that small business had taxes increased on them, but I don't think the government paid a massive penalty for it compared to, let's say, the winter fuel allowance, right? I think there is it's just a question of how much those taxes raise and whether they can come back and keep doing them and what the trade-offs are around them. I mean, it's worth saying in the research we find actually most people already think that Labour's broken its manifesto. Yeah. I mean, fairly or not, that is what they think. So there is a degree, maybe we can get into this, there's a degree in which opinion is, look, it's pretty hostile, but it's not completely unreasonable or completely unmalleable on this topic. And one of the openings for the government to some degree is, frankly, people already think they broke the manifesto. So maybe the shock impact of it is a bit less, but obviously it's a lot harder to come and do that when you're asking people to pay more individually rather than just small business.
Yeah, of course. You broke this down by voter groups, didn't you? Which voters, which demographics are most likely to be, persuadable, amenable to this kind of manifesto breach? Yeah,
I mean, to a very striking degree, actually, how persuadable you are on this topic is kind of influenced by a couple of things, one of which is, frankly, your personal income. but the other one actually is basically how hostile you are to the government. So obviously the voters that are the hardest to persuade are the voters that are the most hostile to government. So like obviously core reform voters, core conservative voters, I would put those in the pretty unpersuadable bracket. There are kind of other groups that are tricky. I mean, we found in the research that this kind of Labour to Reform switcher group, Labour to Reform curious Labour voters, as I've called them, they are not completely unpersuadable, but they are the hardest to persuade. So like partly because they are the most hostile to government of all the different swing groups in the Labour coalition, but also because they have more pressure on their personal income. So that Labour to Reform group is one that is likely to be probably slightly more alienated by any breaching around the manifesto. It's not impossible to sell them on it, and we can get into some of the theories around that. But there's certainly a large majority of them that are very much against it. There are other groups that are a bit more pro, actually not all, including groups that kind of didn't vote Labour at the last election. I mean, there's a sort of a soft Green, soft Lib Dem, even a kind of soft Conservative vote that actually is a bit more predisposed to the government's case on this. And again, that's partly just to do with them being a bit less hostile. Again, it's not easy, but it's possible. And I think it throws up some interesting coalitional dilemmas, which is if that Labour to Reform group is the only group that the government cares about, then this is like really, really dangerous territory. If it's willing to kind of rethink its coalition a bit, there are other groups available to it that it can make the case. It's not easy, but it was quite striking how much, who you are in the electorate is like a very big part of like essentially how persuadable you are on this topic.
Yeah, and what are the differences between these groups, if there are any, on what their priorities would be to see at the end of this parliament in terms of what the government has achieved?
I mean, actually, there's a fairly consistent degree of prioritisation across the Labour electoral coalition on this stuff. I mean, the public, even with, let's say, the Labour Reform group, it is very clear, like public services, NHS, cost of living stuff is salient, and that is also true of the left-leaning bit of the Labour coalition. To a degree, that's the thing that kind of binds together this kind of slightly fractious social democratic coalition. There are differences beyond that. So, like, obviously, boats came up a lot, like progress on small boats, even though it may be not related to tax, but it's clearly more salient to that Labour Reform voter. And interestingly, things like social care and improving things like social care seem to be more rewarded, or failure on it more punished by those Labour Reform voters. And that's partly just to do with their different age profile, I think. But actually, you do see a pretty consistent kind of thing across the Labour coalition, which is its cost of living and its public services. So it's kind of obvious, but it's worth reminding that those are the things really that form the basis of Labour's mandate.
Yeah. And you also looked at how to frame some of these arguments, the story to tell about them that will be most appealing or the least off-putting to voters. So what's the best way? If Labour decided the only way we're going to achieve X, Y and Z is to raise income tax or VAT or national insurance, how would they sell that to voters in a way that, would put the least number of people off?
Again, I think you have to be targeted and look at those that are persuadable. If you look at that, things open up a little bit more if you look at those groups. There is clearly firstly a hygiene thing of like people need to know that those at the top are being asked to pay more. That for me is like a basic hygiene thing, that they don't feel like they're getting screwed while other people get away with it. Yeah. Once you get beyond that, I think you've basically got a couple of different options. Like there is a potential there for a kind of rebuilding the state, rebuilding public services message. I think you probably though need to layer in this kind of cost of living message basically. Like, can the government use this as a pivot to kind of a renewed focus on cost of living? And that would obviously need to involve some policy choices, right? So you're giving some of that money back to people in the short term, or it's part of a wider effort to fund cost of living schemes or get on top of this issue. I think those messages seem to to perform best, particularly with that Labour reform group, was that this can be a platform through which like people can get some of this cash back in the short term through different interventions. Again, it's not easy, but it seemed to be the best way through. One thing that is really clear is I think it's really hard to sell this in a kind of completely negative way. Like, I don't know, just blaming Liz Truss or blaming Brexit or something like that. I think it probably, of course, you need to explain what's changed. I think people are amenable to the idea that Trump and the general chaos in the world has changed. But I think solely selling it through a kind of negative messaging is quite tricky. Probably you do need to make a positive case as much as you possibly can.
Right, that's interesting. And what about the government's opponents if they brought in a budget like this?
Yeah.
What would be the most fruitful attack lines for them?
I mean, yeah, take your pick, right? It's pretty easy. I mean, it's pretty much an open goal for opponents. Look, there's a couple of different ones. There's clearly a kind of straightforward cost of living squeeze message, and I think that's partly why one of the best ways of getting on top of it is being proactive around cost of living, I think, if you're making an argument for it. But if you're against it, then sure, there's a cost of living message. There's also a very palpable sense, I think, that people feel that they pay into a system and they get nothing out of it. And so that there's a kind of middle class squeeze thing there of like you're being asked to pay more tax and it's all going on government waste or something like that. And there's also with that Labour reform group quite a potent message of, I don't know, they're raising your taxes and they're just going to spend it on asylum hotels or migration or something like that. So yeah, it's pretty much a kind of buffet for opponents of like tax rises to choose from. Surprising the research, like people's starting point is hostile. I think it's important to be honest about that. They're not completely unpersuadable or completely unreasonable, but yeah, it really does depend a lot on who you're talking to and who the messenger is.
And one of the big problems, of course, which we haven't spoken about is that trust in politicians and institutions is so low now. Breaking more promises will only add to that problem, which, creates this negative cycle of, poor public opinion, low trust, government, not being able to win people over. It creates a bad atmosphere. So it's not something that, anyone should advocate lightly.
No, absolutely. And I think that's clear in the research. So yeah, it's presented as the least worst option, right? It's there clearly are public trust issues already, and as you say, I suspect the vibe around this kind of doing this kind of thing would worsen that, and that's why it shouldn't be done lightly. It's just, promises were also made around rebuilding the public realm or fixing different things that people care about, and so it's about those trade-offs between those two priorities.
Yeah. Boris Johnson tried it, didn't he, with the health and social care levy that he called it, the rise in national insurance that he introduced that did break a manifesto promise. Yeah,
that's a good point, actually. It has been done before, and of course, although I don't think it broke a manifesto, obviously Labour made a case for tax rises last time it was in government in the early 2000s. I think the difficult aspect here is obviously there's a unique kind of confluence of cost of living pressures, as well as, like, frankly, a government that came in without a very large pool of kind of loyal voters, because it obviously achieved an amazing victory, but it did so on a very efficient share of the vote, right? So it just means that it has slightly a reduced pool of loyalty, I suppose, in the way that maybe Johnson at his height had slightly more people amenable to them. So yeah, there are differences, but you're right, it's not completely without precedent.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing the research. It's fascinating, and I think we'll be looking deeply into it ahead of the budget to see what wriggle room the government has.